right, so thinking again about accent patterns. So once you've kind of gotten comfortable going through something, like a scale, something like that, something sort of straightforward, and accenting with those different rhythmic groupings, so accenting groups of two, with the eighth notes, groups of three with the triplets, groups of four with 16th notes or eighth notes, then what we want to start doing is adding in some melodic groupings that may or may not match those rhythmic groupings. We can do this with anything you want to. I'm going to choose two fairly straightforward ones right now. The first being like a simple like 3 note sequence, so like 1 2 3 2 3 4 3 4 5. So etc. And then diatonic thirds. So that would be a 2 note grouping. And what we're going to do is we're going to take each of those melodic groupings and we're going to put them with each of our subdivisions. Important point for now, we're going to continue to accent the rhythmic groupings. So if we're playing in triplets, we're going to accent the first note, the downbeat. We're going to accent the first of each group of 3. If we're playing eighth notes, we're going to move away from the 2 for now and do 4. Accent the first in each group of 4 notes. But what's going to happen is that as we play a melodic grouping that doesn't match the rhythmic grouping, our ear is going to start to pull a little bit of like a cross rhythm out of that because we'll be a little confused about where that accent actually falls. So here's what we're going to do. I've got the metronome here. I like to put it on 1 and 3. So the metronome is going to be at 50, clicking on 1 and 3. I'm going to be playing like quarter note 100. So here we go. So I'm going to play some of the sequence first. And I'm going to play it in eighth notes. So this is going to be a group of 3, but I'm going to be accenting 4s. So you hear the way that like that accent sort of cuts against the melodic grouping and it starts to feel sort of like you're floating over the time or creating a little bit of a different rhythmic feel there. It's kind of cool. So what we're going to do now is move on to triplets, which will be faster, but maybe easier. So, boom. So an odd thing about that, those triplets is faster for sure. But assuming you've got the metronome set for a tempo where you can execute those triplets, the triplets actually are like a little bit easier. It's a little strange. The quarter notes tend to be hard. That rhythmic confusion, that sort of cross rhythm that's implied by the mismatch in the melody and the rhythm is really interesting and can make that really, really tricky to play. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the diatonic thirds. So that's going to be, again, a grouping of 2 notes. Boom, bum, bum, bum. And so that should match pretty well with our eighth notes, accenting in 4s. And that'll come out nicely. But when we play the triplets and we're accenting that first note of each triplet, we're going to get that same sort of push and pull cross rhythm feeling, which is cool. So here we go. So that matches up pretty well. Nothing too crazy going on there. But we're going to try triplets now, and that's going to be faster, of course, also. But also we're going to be accenting in 3s, but playing a melodic grouping that wants us grouping in 2s or 4s. So it's going to be a little tricky. Sloppy there in the middle, but that's it. So we can do this with really any scale pattern we want to, and it's really useful because scales by themselves are not super useful. You know, we say that they're really good for working on technique, but like, what is that technique? If you're just playing the scales straight up and down, you get very quickly, what's the point of doing that? You start adding these patterns in, you get a lot more mileage out of it. You start learning where all this stuff sits, different fingerings for things, how you can get through it, how things sort of gel together and inside the key. It's great, but you play it through 12 keys. You start to get to a point of diminishing returns with each of these things as you get more familiar with them, and that's where this other stuff becomes really important, because scales are wonderful vehicles for working through this kind of stuff. How else would you practice these kind of accent patterns and things like that? I mean, I'm sure there are other ways. Someone will probably let me know. But scales by themselves, nothing to write home about. Same way, like if you're playing in a tune, just playing a scale up and down doesn't really do much for you. But a well-placed scale run that swings and gets you somewhere is great. Is awesome. We love it. Which brings me to sort of another point. These accents are super, super, super important, and a really important thing to start putting into scale practice, because I really think they're a huge part of what makes this kind of music like jump and move. We tend to think, when we think of swing, we tend to think of this sort of lengthened eighth note, this sort of swing eighth note, and that is certainly something people do. But I don't think that lengthened eighth note, that sort of swing eighth note, can really swing all that much without the sort of freedom of these really interesting accent patterns, the way that notes pop out of the line and things like that. So I think it's a really important thing to practice. And I do think the reverse is true, where, for example, someone who plays with a pretty straight eighth note but has like a lot of freedom and a lot of command over these accents and can sort of tell the time what it wants the time to do and things like that, those absolutely can swing. People do that all the time. There are loads of people that play a pretty straight eighth note but still really swing. So this is a really important thing to start getting into the practice. At least for me, something I've found that's really helpful. So go ahead and check this out. This is a great thing to do. Try things like I'd say intervals, little short sequences, 3 and 4 note sequences. The intervals, diatonic triads, diatonic seventh chords, all that sort of like normal scale vocabulary stuff. We can do this. Take them through different subdivisions at whatever tempos they're manageable, and keep the accents on the rhythmic grouping and see how it starts to cut against the melodic groupings, and how interesting the sound can start to get. So anyway, we'll come back at another point with some more stuff on the accent patterns, but that's probably plenty for now.